Civilization is not sustainable. Our current financial, religious, and government leaders are not trying to attain sustainability. Some think different leaders could. However, I believe their leadership positions do not have that power. Instead, the power to attain or degrade sustainability is distributed among 7 billion people, which focuses this video on answering 2 questions. What collected behavior creates a sustainable civilization? And what role does cognition play in attaining that collection? To answer these questions, consider that when 7.6 billion individuals choose children, housing, transportation, food, education, healthcare, and entertainment, the collected behavior destroys the environment, collapses civilization, and injures our children. Let me use a simplified civilization to explain this tragedy. In it, a person needs space to live and food to consume. A person requires time to reproduce. A person has a lifespan, maybe 100 of these reproductive intervals. During an interval, 150 units of food flow in and 250 units of waste flow out. There is space for 10 people. Having room means that after the population exceeds 10, the people pile up into 2 layers. A person on the second layer gets no food and starves to death. Persons that die from starvation or old age fall to the bottom and are carried away by a waste removal system. However, when the dead bodies are not carried away, they turn the civilization toxic and all people die. Let's calculate the civilization's injury deaths that result from various collected behavior. I will plot these deaths on several graphs. The time it takes a person to reproduce is this time interval. The blue columns depict the number of people born in each interval. The red columns are the number of people that die from starvation or poisoning. The green columns are the number of people that die of old age. Since longevity is 100 intervals, there are no deaths from old age in the first 100 periods. The population is computed by cumulatively adding birth columns, injury death columns, and old age death columns. Notice that a stable population occurs if there are no births or deaths during an interval, or if there are an equal number of births and deaths. The cumulative injury line is computed by summing the red columns. Let's do an example to see who dies of injuries and when in this civilization. At time 0, there is 1 person in the civilization. The 1 person reproduces, leaving 2 people at the end of the first interval, and during the second interval, the 2 reproduce, leaving 4. The third interval starts with 4 and ends with 8. Notice there are no injury deaths and no old age deaths. In the 4th interval, when 8 births are added to the existing 8, the population tries to rise to 16. However, since space allows only 10 of them to reach the food, 6 starve to death, leaving a population at the beginning of the 5th interval of 10. The population curve for the first 4 intervals looks like this. Then, in the 5th and successive intervals, there are just 10 births and 10 deaths, which lead to a constant population. Summing these injury death columns gives this line. It has a slope of 10 deaths per interval. That's not nice. It means almost all the people born die of starvation. This civilization is a sustainable system, however, with accumulating injury. Next, let's calculate injury deaths resulting from different collected behavior. For example, assume through technology, the civilization space can be expanded to accommodate 20 people. After rescaling the population graph, we see in the next interval 10 people are born, none die, the population rises to 20, and since no people starve, cumulative injury deaths do not increase. Looks good? Not exactly. During the next interval, 20 people give birth, temporarily raising the population to 40, not shown. Since there is space for only 20, 20 of these 40 die of starvation, leaving a population of 20. In successive intervals, because births equal deaths from starvation, the population remains constant. While doubling space prevented starvation deaths for one interval, it also doubled the rate of starvation deaths forever. Increasing the civilization size to 30 after an interval of no deaths will produce a death rate of 30. A civilization of 40 produces a death rate of 40. A civilization size of 100 could have a death rate of 100. People might hope, if they keep increasing civilization size fast enough, they might never have high death rates. However, there are constraints. For example, food flow in limits the maximum population. Thus, the maximum starvation deaths per interval cannot exceed 150. Consider another case where these industrious people double the food supply to 300 and double the space to 300. Then maybe the max population would be 300 and the max deaths per interval would be 300. Not quite. Remember that civilization has a waste removal system of 250. Once the people die faster than 250, toxins increase, killing them all. When population rises above 250, it drops to 0. Thus far, what have we learned about injury deaths and different collected behavior? With normal collected procreative behavior, the population expands into either a steady state condition, where births equal deaths from starvation, or a poisoning condition, where all people die. The first is sustainable with continuous injury, and the second is not sustainable and experiences a total die-off. Consider a different civilization, one which has food for 300, space for 300, waste handling for 300, and one more change. The reproduction time equals a lifetime. That means births equal deaths. The plots with time intervals of lifetimes looks like this. Births equal old age deaths, injury deaths. Each interval would be 0, cumulative injury deaths would be non-increasing, and population would be constant. The civilization is sustainable without injury. To this configuration, where people produce once each lifetime, let's do some additional behaviors to see who dies of injuries and when. Consider if half the people consume 2 portions of food and the other half get no food. The fed half reproduce and die of old age, and the unfed half starve to death and don't reproduce. During the first interval, there are 150 births, 300 deaths, population declines to 150, cumulative injury deaths increase to 150, and the waste removal system removes the 300 dead bodies. In successive intervals, because births equal old age deaths and there are no more injury deaths, the population of 150 remains constant. This configuration, after experiencing a one-time die-off, transitions to a new sustainable state without future deaths. Next, consider another configuration. In this configuration, the people eat 1 unit of food each, reproduce once per lifetime, but uniquely, half the people occupy twice their normal space. The aggressive space consumers move the remaining people to the second layer, where there is no food, and each of them starves to death. It graphs a lot like the civilization where people eat twice the food. The 2x space consumers survive to reproduce and die of old age. Those relegated to the no food level die of starvation and don't reproduce. During the first interval, the world experiences 150 births, 300 deaths, population declines to 150, and cumulative deaths rise to 150. During future intervals, because births equal old age deaths and there are no further injury deaths, population holds constant. The system, suffering once from the change in space utilization behaviors, has transitioned to a sustainable state without further injuries. Actually, a civilization can achieve sustainability without future injury deaths at many different space utilizations or food consumption levels. For example, if part of the group utilized 3 times or 4 times the space or food, the population, that interval, would decline respectively, and cumulative deaths would increase respectively. However, after the initial interval, each would be sustainable without future deaths. Thus far, we have shown that a civilization's injury deaths vary with changes in size, food flow in, waste flow out, reproduction interval relative to lifespan, and individual consumption. We have identified collective behavior that cause sustainable populations, one-time injury deaths, continuing injury deaths, no injury deaths, that is, everyone dies of old age, and we have discovered behaviors and civilization conditions where entire populations die off. All these paths forward resulted from the collective behavior of people, each of whom is using a primitive set of cognitive abilities and a small repertoire of behavior that included procreation, food consumption, and space utilization. However, if we expanded these abilities and behaviors, then the collective behavior of these people could produce other paths forward. Consider what new outcomes could occur if the people added the physical abilities to kill each other, steal from each other, hoard space or food, destroy stores, disrupt food production, or diminish world services. Consider what new outcomes could occur if they added cognitive abilities like perception of relative and absolute well-being, memory of previous conditions, comparison of these memories to present conditions, inference to predict future conditions based on environmental structure and various behavior, and choice among alternative behaviors. With these additions, people could produce many new pathways. Some good, like advancement of technology, art, science, healthcare, education, social networks that facilitate economies of scale, specialization of labor, and trade. Some bad, like increasing social conflict, destruction of infrastructure, diminishment of environmental services. Now, let's use the simple civilization to answer this question. Can these additions create a set of collective behavior that maintains a constant population and produces no injury? Remember that a group's collective behavior is the sum of the behaviors chosen by its members. Also, that each member performs many behaviors. Some of these behaviors are of particular importance in creating sustainable and non-injury producing civilizations. Let me focus on the ones that allow a person to lift his or her personal well-being above subsistence. Some people are more successful lifting than others. This results in a community that has hierarchy. Perception of this hierarchy motivates a variety of new behaviors. For example, increasing efficiency changes the hierarchy without causing injury. A person killing another and taking its supporting resource stream improves its own well-being and causes a one-time injury. If a person takes part of another's support and the second person does not die, injury is recurring each time period. And when a person's behaviors create toxins, both he and another person is injured. However, neither knows what action caused the injury. What happens when two extensions work together? For example, one person steals another's resources to improve his or her well-being, and the losing person perceives the actor's action and feels the loss. The combination results in a behavior not present in the previous world: conflict. Conflict behaviors, killing, hoarding, destroying stores, disrupting productive systems, and diminishing the environment, have the added effect of diverting the civilization's supporting resources to conflict, which lowers everyone's well-being. What is more insidious is that the increase in scarcity is perceived and initiates more conflict, which increases more scarcity. This scarcity conflict death spiral, once started, keeps going until all the people are dead and the civilization collapses. The only way to prevent this outcome is to not trip the death spiral. The important question for this simple civilization's sustainability is, can these cognitive additions discover the death spiral structure embedded in it and use the perception to implement collected behavior that does not trip it? Let me give one large caveat. Discovering the loop structure cannot depend on experience, because that would mean the loop is tripped and the simple civilization is on its way to total destruction. Instead, I propose a process that depends on building and using abstractions to implement discovery of the loop structure, and then using the loop structure for identifying the behavior that prevents tripping it. The product of this discovery activity I call anticipatory behavior. Let's use a simple civilization to describe how anticipatory behaviors prevent injury and produce sustainability. First, let's investigate what unfolds when there are no cognitive or behavioral additions, and thus no chance of having anticipatory behavior. With these food, space, waste, and reproductive parameters, collective behavior creates constant population, constant consumption, no inequity, and no conflict. This civilization is sustainable and produces no injuries. Consider what happens if delivered food is reduced by 15 units. Then 15 people starve to death, 15 people don't reproduce, and the remaining 285 attain a new level of sustainability without further injury. However, when people have these additional abilities, the decrease in food delivery trips a scarcity conflict death spiral, and 300 people die. Are there any collected behavior that could have prevented the death spiral? I can think of one. If collected behavior contracted the population to 285 before food deliveries dropped, then the loss of food delivery does not increase scarcity and does not trip the scarcity conflict death spiral. In this case, anticipatory behavior prevents injuries. When anticipatory behaviors contract population before the existence of a decrease in space, or a decrease in waste capacity, or an increase in consumption, or an increase in inequity, then these changes create no injury. One might conclude that in this simple civilization, using anticipatory behavior to reduce population is the most powerful way to prevent injury and produce sustainability. Next, let's extend what we have learned in this simple civilization to humans living on Earth. We live in a filled-up world. Behaviors that increase population kill people. Behaviors that increase consumption kill people. Behaviors that increase inequity kill people. Behaviors that increase technology but don't prevent expanding into constraints kill people. We live in a world where supporting services are in decline. This means less oil, coal, and uranium, less soil, fish, and forest, less mineable minerals and metals, less atmosphere and ocean services, and these losses in support kill people. We live in a world where people kill each other, cultures sanction killing, and institutions commit mass murder. We live in a world where conflict creates scarcity by diverting resources to making war, destroying production systems, and by having to repair what is broken. Since increasing scarcity creates increasing conflict, and increasing conflict creates increasing scarcity, our world has a built-in scarcity conflict death spiral. Once triggered, it collapses civilization. It starves to death or kills in conflict almost everyone who lives after 2030. It makes our survivors live without medicine, electric lights, or running water. And because it lowers our ability to access energy, it prevents our survivors from rebuilding today's technology. According to the simple civilization, the most powerful tool to prevent this death spiral and avoid these injuries is anticipatory behavior. And the most powerful anticipatory behavior contracts human footprint fast enough to prevent scarcity, even with shrinking supporting services. To accommodate these shrinking services, anticipatory calculations suggest global population may have to decrease from 7.6 billion people to 50 million by 2100. This much smaller population might be supported at a high-tech lifestyle and be both sustainable and produce no injury. Our anticipatory calculation suggests that the 50 million people would be distributed within 3 hydro-powered enclaves. That each enclave's production activities must rely on recycling of non-renewable resources, not extracting them, not depend on any exhaustible resources, coal, oil, gas, or uranium, and consume less than the Earth's annual production of renewables, soil, water, oceans, and air. And that the collective behavior limit births to deaths, limits stratification of well-being to below that which produces conflict, assigns the ownership of supporting resources to the next 100 generations. Current individuals only lease these resources from the ownership body, and then only if she or he can return them in the state of issue. Can humans get themselves to take the anticipatory behaviors that would transition to and maintain a sustainable, not injury-producing civilization? It all depends on our abilities to give meaning to injuries before they occur, visualize collected behavior that avoid the injuries, and motivate the Earth's existing constituency to implement a social contract that creates these collective behavior. What has this simple civilization taught us? Sustainability without injury requires anticipatory behavior, and the anticipatory behavior must produce population decline fast enough to prevent the scarcity that trips a scarcity conflict death spiral.